The blizzard descended on the Arizona high country like God's own fury, turning the world into a white hell that swallowed everything whole. Hannah Garrett urged her exhausted mare through snowdrifts that reached the animal's chest, her fingers so numb inside her thin gloves that she could barely feel the reins anymore. She had left Prescott 3 days ago with supplies meant to last a week, planning to reach her sister's homestead near the Mogollon Rim before the weather turned. The storm had other plans. Now she was lost, freezing and watching her horse falter with each struggling step through the January wasteland that the high plateau had become. The wind screamed across the open range, driving needles of ice into her face until her cheeks felt raw and bleeding. Hannah squinted through the whiteout, searching desperately for any sign of shelter. Her heavy wool coat, which had seemed so adequate in Prescott's general store, might as well have been paper for all the protection it offered against this killing cold. Her teeth chattered so violently she bit her tongue, tasting copper blood in her mouth. Then, like a miracle emerging from the storm's rage, she saw it. A dark shape materialized through the driving snow, solid and square and promising. A cabin. Hannah's heart lurched with desperate hope as she guided her mare toward it, praying it was not some cruel hallucination born of cold and exhaustion. But no, as they drew closer, the structure became more defined. Log walls, a stone chimney, a small barn set off to one side. Smoke rose from the chimney, barely visible against the gray-white sky, and that sight was more beautiful to Hannah than any sunset she had ever witnessed. She slid from her horse's back, and her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Her feet were blocks of ice in her boots, unresponsive and clumsy. She stumbled toward the cabin door, leading her mare by instinct more than conscious thought. Her fist connected with the solid wood 3 times before her strength gave out and she sagged against the doorframe, her vision tunneling to a pinpoint. The door swung open so suddenly that Hannah pitched forward into warmth and light. Strong hands caught her before she hit the floor, and she found herself staring up into the most striking face she had ever seen. The man who held her had dark hair that fell across his forehead, eyes the color of amber whiskey, and a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-20s, perhaps 5 or 6 years older than her own 21 years. Concern etched deep lines around his eyes as he studied her. "Jesus Christ, woman, you are about frozen solid," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Come on, let me get you inside." Hannah tried to speak, but her jaw would not cooperate. The man half carried her to a chair near the fireplace, where flames crackled and danced with blessed heat. He moved with swift efficiency, pulling her sodden gloves from her hands, unlacing her ice-crusted boots. "Your horse," Hannah finally managed through chattering teeth. "She is out there. I will see to her in a minute. First, I need to make sure you are not going to die in my chair." He disappeared for a moment and returned with thick wool blankets that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. He wrapped them around her shoulders, then knelt to examine her hands and feet. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused, work-hardened hands. "Can you feel this?" He pressed his thumb against the arch of her foot, and Hannah nodded. "Hurts," she whispered. "Good. Pain means the flesh is still alive." He wrapped her feet in more blankets, then stood. "I am going to get your horse. Do not try to move. Just sit there and thaw." He shrugged into a heavy coat and disappeared into the storm. Hannah sat shivering before the fire, gradually becoming aware of her surroundings. The cabin was small but well kept, with a bed in one corner, a table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies and books. A coffee pot sat on a trivet near the fire, and the smell of something savory simmering in a pot made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. The man returned several minutes later, his shoulders and hat white with fresh snow. He stamped his boots and hung his coat on a peg by the door. "Your mare is in the barn with my horses, fed and watered. She will be fine." He studied Hannah with those amber eyes. "What in God's name were you doing out in this storm?" Hannah pulled the blankets tighter around herself. Now that sensation was returning to her extremities. Everything hurt with a fierce, burning intensity. "I was traveling to my sister's place near the rim." "I did not expect the weather to turn so quickly." "Nobody did. This storm came out of nowhere." He poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her, wrapping her hands around it. "Drink, slow sips." The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter and hot, and it was the most wonderful thing Hannah had ever tasted. She sipped it carefully, feeling warmth begin to spread through her core. "Thank you," she said. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You would have another hour or two in that cold." He pulled a chair over and sat facing her, his forearms resting on his knees. "I am Dalton Anderson. This is my place, such as it is. Hannah Garrett." She managed a weak smile. "I apologize for nearly dying on your doorstep." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "I have had worse visitors, at least you knocked." He stood and moved to the pot hanging over the fire, ladling stew into a bowl. "You need to eat. Get some strength back." Hannah accepted the bowl gratefully. The stew was simple, venison and vegetables, but it tasted like a feast. She ate slowly, aware of Dalton watching her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow did not. There was nothing predatory in his gaze, just careful assessment, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. "How long have I been traveling?" she asked between bites. "I lost track of the days." "Today is January 15th, 1883, Dalton said. "And that storm shows no signs of letting up. You are going to be here for a while." Hannah looked toward the single window, where snow pressed against the glass like a living thing. A thread of worry wound through her chest. "My sister will be expecting me." "Cannot be helped. Even if the storm clears tomorrow, which it will not, the drifts will be too deep to travel for days." Dalton poured himself coffee and leaned against the table, his long legs crossed at the ankles. "You are welcome to stay as long as you need. I have plenty of supplies." "I do not want to impose on your hospitality more than necessary," Hannah said. "It is not an imposition." "It is January in the high country. Common decency says you do not turn a soul out into a storm like that." He gestured toward the window with his cup. "Besides, I do not mind the company. Winter up here gets lonely." Hannah studied him over the rim of her bowl. Dalton Anderson carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, but there was something else there too. A wariness, perhaps, or a loneliness that matched the isolation of his mountain cabin. "You live up here alone?" "For the past 2 years. I run cattle in the lower valleys, but I prefer it up here, quieter." He drained his coffee. "You should rest. There is the bed. I will make do with blankets by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Hannah protested. "You can and you will. You just about froze to death, Miss Garrett." "You need proper rest." His tone brooked no argument. "I have slept in worse places than a warm cabin floor." Hannah was too exhausted to argue further. She finished her stew and let Dalton guide her to the bed, where she collapsed onto the mattress still wrapped in blankets. Sleep pulled at her like a riptide and she surrendered to it, her last conscious thought that she was safe, at least for now, in this stranger's home. She woke in darkness, disoriented and aching. The fire still burned in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Dalton sat in the chair she had first occupied, a book open on his lap, reading by the firelight. He must have sensed her movement because he looked up, meeting her eyes across the small space. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. Hannah took inventory of herself. Everything hurt, a deep bone ache that spoke of the trauma her body had endured, but it was the normal pain of recovery, not the numbness of frostbite. Better, I think. What time is it? Near midnight. You slept about 6 hours. Dalton closed his book and stood, moving to check the fire. Are you hungry? Thirsty? Water, please. He brought her a dipper full of cold water, and Hannah drank gratefully. Dalton settled back into his chair, and Hannah found herself studying him in the firelight. He had a face made for this harsh country, all strong lines and weathered toughness, but there was kindness in the set of his mouth, intelligence in his eyes. "What were you reading?" she asked. Dalton held up the book. "Shakespeare, The Tempest." "I have read it a dozen times, but I keep finding new things in it." Hannah felt her eyebrows rise. "I did not expect to find a cowboy reading Shakespeare on a mountain in the middle of a blizzard. People rarely are what you expect them to be, Miss Garrett." There was no rancor in his voice, just simple statement of fact. "My mother was a schoolteacher back in Missouri. She made sure I could read before I could rope. I am grateful for it. Books are good company in the winter." "What brought you to Arizona?" Hannah asked. She knew she should probably go back to sleep, but she found herself reluctant to end this strange, intimate conversation in the firelit darkness. Dalton was silent for a long moment, and Hannah thought perhaps she had overstepped. But then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I needed a fresh start. Made some mistakes back home, nothing criminal, just young and stupid. Figured the territories would give me room to be someone different." He looked at her. "What about you? What brings a young woman traveling alone through high country in the middle of winter?" "My sister married a rancher last year. She wrote asking me to come help her. She is expecting her first child in the spring and wanted family nearby." Hannah pulled the blankets closer. "I left Gila Bend 6 months ago to work in Prescott. Saved enough money for the journey and supplies." "Gila Bend? That is a long way south. How did you end up there?" Hannah hesitated, old pain stirring in her chest. "My parents died of cholera 2 years ago. My sister and I had only each other. When she married and moved to her husband's ranch, I stayed in Gila Bend working as a seamstress, but I missed her. When she wrote, I decided to go." "I am sorry about your parents." Dalton's voice was genuinely sympathetic. "That is a hard thing." It was, but we survive what we must. Hannah shifted on the bed, trying to find a more comfortable position. "I appreciate you taking me in, Mr. Anderson. Many men would not have been so kind to a stranger. Call me Dalton. And like I said, it is just common decency." He stood and added another log to the fire. "You should try to sleep more. Your body needs rest to recover." Hannah nodded, already feeling sleep pulling at her again. "Good night, Dalton." "Good night, Hannah." She slept deeply and woke to pale gray light filtering through the window and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Hannah sat up slowly, testing her body. The aching had subsided to a dull soreness, and her fingers and toes felt normal if tender. She stood and made her way to the window, pulling aside the curtain. Snow. Endless snow. The world outside was buried under white, with drifts reaching halfway up the cabin walls. The storm still raged, though perhaps with slightly less fury than the night before. Hannah's heart sank as she realized Dalton had been right. She would not be leaving any time soon. "Morning," Dalton said from behind her. "Breakfast is almost ready." Hannah turned to find him standing by the fire, tending a pan of bacon and eggs. He had shaved, she noticed, revealing the strong line of his jaw, and his dark hair was damp as if he had washed in cold water. "Good morning." "I should have been helping you. You are a guest, and you nearly died yesterday. Sit down and eat." He divided the food between 2 plates and brought one to the table. They ate in companionable silence. The food was simple but good. cooked with the easy competence of a man who had been taking care of himself for a long time. Hannah found herself watching Dalton's hands as he ate, noting the scars across his knuckles, the calluses that spoke of hard work. They were capable hands, strong and sure. "What do you do all winter up here?" Hannah asked. "It must get terribly isolated." "I read, carve, keep the stock fed and the cabin maintained. Sometimes I snowshoe down to the lower valleys to check on the cattle if the weather permits." Dalton refilled his coffee. "It is quiet, but I like that. After growing up in a house full of brothers and sisters, I appreciate the peace." "How many siblings do you have?" "5. 3 brothers, 2 sisters, all back in Missouri, married with families of their own now." A shadow crossed his face. "I am the black sheep, I suppose. The one who could not settle down. Or perhaps you are the brave one," Hannah suggested. "The one willing to forge your own path instead of following the expected route." Dalton looked at her with surprise, and something warm flickered in his amber eyes. "I had not thought of it that way. Sometimes we are harder on ourselves than we need to be." Hannah traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "I understand the feeling. My parents wanted me to marry and settle down. They had a nice young man picked out for me, a store clerk in Gila Bend, safe and predictable. I tried to care for him, but I could not. I wanted more than a quiet life behind a counter. So you left." "After they died, yes. It seemed like permission in a way, terrible to say but true." Hannah met his eyes. "I do not know what I am looking for exactly, but I will know it when I find it." "That makes you the brave one," Dalton said quietly. The storm continued throughout the day, and Hannah found herself settling into the rhythm of the cabin. She insisted on helping with chores despite Dalton's protests, needing to feel useful. They worked together preparing meals, tending the fire, caring for the horses in the barn. Dalton had 3 horses besides her mare, all sturdy mountain-bred animals built for the harsh country. He moved among them with easy affection, speaking to them in low tones, and Hannah found herself charmed by this gentle side of him. In the afternoon, they sat by the fire and talked. Hannah learned that Dalton was 27, that he had fought in the Apache campaigns before realizing he had no stomach for the Army's brutality toward the native people. He had mustered out and started ranching, building his herd slowly through hard work and careful trading. He loved this high country with a passion that shone through his words, despite its harsh conditions. Hannah told him about her life in Gila Bend, the oppressive heat and the endless sameness of days spent sewing in a dim shop. She talked about her sister Clara, 4 years older, who had always been the responsible one, the one who made safe choices. "I love her dearly," Hannah said, "but we are very different. She is content with a small world. I want to see everything, experience everything." "And yet you were traveling to live with her," Dalton observed. "For now, to help with the baby, but I do not plan to stay forever." Hannah watched the flames dance in the fireplace. "I want to see California someday, maybe even San Francisco. I have heard it is a remarkable city." "I have been there," Dalton said. "Stopped on my way south from Oregon. It is remarkable, all right. Dirty and crowded and exciting. I could not live there, but I am glad I saw it." "Tell me about it," Hannah said eagerly, and Dalton obliged, spinning stories of the fog-shrouded bay, the steep hills, the babel of languages spoken on every corner. Hannah listened, entranced, watching his face as he spoke. He came alive when he talked about his travels, the wariness falling away to reveal enthusiasm and curiosity. The day faded into evening, and they ate dinner together. Afterward, Dalton taught Hannah to play poker using dried beans as chips. She proved an apt student, winning more hands than she lost, and Dalton's surprised laughter filled the cabin. "You have a devious mind, Hannah Garrett," he said as she raked in another pot of beans. Or perhaps you are simply not as good at reading people as you think you are, Dalton Anderson, she countered, grinning. That is entirely possible. He dealt another hand, and their fingers brushed as she reached for her cards. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through Hannah, something electric and warm. She looked up to find Dalton watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The moment stretched between them, laden with possibility. Then, Dalton cleared his throat and looked back at his cards. "Your play," he said, his voice slightly rough. Hannah forced her attention back to the game, but she was aware of every movement Dalton made, every breath, every shift of his body. Something was building between them, something neither of them had spoken aloud but both could feel. That night, Hannah lay in Dalton's bed while he made his pallet by the fire, and she found herself wishing the small cabin was even smaller, wishing the distance between them did not exist. She had known him less than 2 days, but it felt longer. It felt right, being here with him. The thought should have frightened her, but it did not. Instead, it filled her with a strange, bubbling excitement. The storm raged for 3 more days. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist beyond the endless white and the howling wind. Inside, Hannah and Dalton created their own small universe. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Dalton told her about the summers he spent working on riverboats on the Mississippi, the winter he nearly starved prospecting in Colorado, the time he won a horse in a poker game in Tombstone. Hannah shared her dreams of traveling, of maybe opening her own dress shop someday in a big city, of learning to ride like the vaqueras she had seen in Arizona, fearless and free. They cooked together, moving around the small space with increasing ease, learning each other's rhythms. Dalton showed Hannah how to make proper sourdough biscuits, and she taught him a stew recipe her mother had made. They played cards and read aloud to each other from Dalton's small library. His taste ran to adventure stories and Shakespeare, with a few volumes of poetry thrown in. Hannah discovered he had a fine reading voice, rich and expressive. On the 4th morning, Hannah woke to silence. The absence of wind was so complete it seemed to ring in her ears. She sat up and looked to where Dalton stood at the window, already dressed. "The storm has broken," he said without turning around. Hannah's heart sank even as she told herself she should be relieved. She could continue to her sister's place now. She could stop imposing on Dalton's hospitality. But the thought of leaving filled her with a desolation that shocked her with its intensity. She dressed quickly and joined Dalton at the window. The world outside gleamed brilliant white under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The sun sparkled off the snow like scattered diamonds. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly impersonal, a reminder that the storm had moved on and so must she. "I should think about leaving soon," Hannah said, hating each word as it left her mouth. Dalton was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to face her, and the expression on his face made her breath stop. There was longing there and conflict and something that looked very much like fear. "Stay," he said quietly. "Not just until the snow melts. Stay forever." Hannah stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Dalton, I have only been here 5 days. I know how that sounds. I know people will say I am crazy." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "But Hannah, I have never felt this way before. Every moment I spend with you feels right. When you laugh, I want to do whatever it takes to make you laugh again. When you talk about your dreams, I want to be part of them. I want to show you California and everywhere else you want to go. I want to wake up every morning and see you in my cabin. I want this to be our cabin." "You are asking me to marry you," Hannah said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I know it is too soon. I know you probably think I am insane, but I have learned that opportunities do not come around twice. You walked into my life in the middle of a blizzard, and I will be damned if I let you walk back out without telling you how I feel." Dalton took a step closer to her, his amber eyes locked on hers. "I am in love with you, Hannah Garrett. I think I have been since you fell through my door half frozen to death. Stay with me. Build a life with me. Not because you need shelter or because you have no other option, but because you want to. Because you feel this thing between us too." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. "I do feel it," she said. "I thought I was losing my mind falling for someone so quickly, but Dalton, I hardly know you. Then stay and know me. We have all the time in the world." He reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I am not asking you to be someone you are not. I do not want to cage you. I want to be your partner, your companion. We can travel when the seasons allow. We can see California together. Hell, we can see the whole damn country if that is what you want. But at the end of every journey, we come home to each other. We build something together." Hannah looked up into his face, at the hope and vulnerability written there. She thought about the past 5 days, about how right it had felt being with him. She thought about the easy way they talked, the comfortable silences, the spark she felt every time they touched. She thought about the life spread out before her, traveling to her sister's place, being the unmarried aunt, returning eventually to some small town to sew dresses until she was old and gray. Then she thought about a different life. Waking up beside Dalton, learning the rhythms of the seasons on this mountain, traveling together when wanderlust struck, building something solid and real with a man who read Shakespeare and made her laugh and looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will stay. I will marry you." The joy that blazed across Dalton's face was like sunrise. He caught her up in his arms, lifting her off her feet, and then his lips were on hers and Hannah was kissing him back with all the pent-up longing of the past days. The kiss was deep and searching, a promise and a celebration all at once. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I will make you happy," he said fiercely. "I swear it, Hannah. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this choice." "I know you will," Hannah said, and she realized with a sense of profound certainty that it was true. "And I will make you happy too. We will make each other happy." They spent the rest of that day planning. Dalton would take Hannah down to the lower valleys as soon as the snow was passable. They would find a preacher, get married properly, and then send word to Hannah's sister explaining the change in plans. Hannah would write to Clara herself, of course. She owed her sister that much. But the thought of disappointing Clara could not dim Hannah's joy. "She will think I have lost my mind," Hannah said as they sat close together on Dalton's bed, his arm around her shoulders. "Perhaps you have," Dalton said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Perhaps we both have. But I think sometimes madness is really just clarity, knowing what you want and having the courage to reach for it." "When did you become a philosopher?" Hannah teased. "When I fell in love with a woman stubborn enough to ride into a blizzard." He pulled her closer. "We should probably sleep. We have a long journey ahead of us once we can travel." But neither of them moved. They sat together as the fire burned low, talking in quiet voices about the life they would build. Dalton told her about the ranch he wanted to expand, the herd he was growing. Hannah talked about maybe taking in sewing work from the town during the winter months, not because she needed to, but because she enjoyed the craft. They discussed children, both agreeing they wanted them but in no particular rush. There was time for all of it. Finally, exhaustion claimed them both. Hannah insisted they share the bed now that they were engaged, pointing out that they were both adults and it was foolish for Dalton to sleep on the floor when there was room for two. Dalton agreed, though he was scrupulously careful to maintain a respectful distance between them. Still, Hannah fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, feeling safer and more content than she had in years. They waited 3 days for the snow to settle enough for travel. During that time, they continued learning each other. Dalton taught Hannah to shoot his rifle, standing behind her to guide her aim, his arms bracketing hers. Hannah demonstrated her prowess with a needle, mending a tear in Dalton's favorite shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. They kissed frequently, growing more comfortable with each other, learning what brought pleasure and laughter. On the morning they were to leave, Dalton saddled all the horses while Hannah packed supplies. She was loading the last of their gear when she heard hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Dalton emerged from the barn, his hand resting on his pistol, his body tense. 3 riders appeared through the trees, their horses laboring through the deep snow. As they drew closer, Hannah could see they were cowboys, weathered men in their 30s and 40s bundled against the cold. The lead rider pulled up when he spotted Dalton. "Anderson, glad to see you made it through the storm all right." Dalton relaxed slightly. "Jennings, did you boys have trouble?" The man called Jennings dismounted and his companions followed suit. "Lost part of the roof on the line shack down in Cedar Valley. Came to see if you had any spare lumber." His eyes drifted to Hannah, curiosity evident on his face. "This is my fiancée, Hannah Garrett," Dalton said, moving to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. "Hannah, this is Tom Jennings. He runs cattle in the valley south of here." Hannah saw surprise flicker across Jennings' face, but to his credit, he recovered quickly and touched his hat brim. "Madam, congratulations to you both." "Thank you," Hannah said, squeezing Dalton's hand. They spent an hour helping Jennings and his men load lumber from Dalton's woodpile. The cowboys were friendly, if curious, asking carefully polite questions about where Hannah was from and how she and Dalton had met. Dalton told a simplified version of the story, and Hannah watched the men's faces soften as they realized she had nearly died in the storm. "Well, I reckon that is what you might call fate," Jennings said, grinning. "Storm like that could have dropped you anywhere, but it put you right on Anderson's doorstep. Some might say that is a sign." "I certainly think so," Hannah said, smiling up at Dalton. After Jennings and his men left, Dalton and Hannah finally set out. The journey down from the high country was slow and treacherous, the horses picking their way carefully through deep drifts. But the day was clear and cold, the sky a dome of brilliant blue overhead. Hannah rode beside Dalton, marveling at the landscape. The storm had transformed everything into a wonderland of white. The pines heavy with snow, icicles hanging like crystal chandeliers from rocky outcroppings. They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow, building a fire and huddling close together for warmth under their combined blankets. Dalton held Hannah in his arms and she listened to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. "Of what?" "That we are making a mistake, that we are moving too fast." Dalton was silent for a moment, his hand stroking her hair. "No," he said finally. "I am not scared of that. The only thing that frightens me is the thought of not taking this chance, of letting you go and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." Hannah tilted her head back to look at him in the firelight. "I feel the same way. It is strange. I have always been so careful, so practical, but this feels like the first truly right decision I have made in my life. Maybe being careful is overrated." Dalton kissed her softly. "Maybe sometimes you have to leap and trust that you will land safely." They reached the town of Payson 2 days later. It was a small settlement, rough and utilitarian, but it had a church and a preacher. Reverend Matthews was a jovial man in his 50s who listened to their story with twinkling eyes and agreed to marry them the following day. "I can see you are in love," he said, beaming at them both. "And the Lord works in mysterious ways. Who am I to question a blessing delivered in a blizzard?" They spent that night in the town's boarding house in separate rooms this time. Hannah lay awake for hours, her mind racing. Tomorrow she would become Dalton Anderson's wife. Tomorrow her entire life would change. The enormity of it should have terrified her, but instead she felt a rising excitement, a sense of standing on the precipice of something wonderful. The wedding was small, attended only by Reverend Matthews, his wife, and a couple of curious townspeople. Hannah wore the best dress she had packed, a simple blue wool that matched her eyes. Dalton wore clean clothes and had shaved again, and when he saw her, his face lit up with such pure joy that Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Hannah spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, promising to love and honor Dalton for the rest of her life. Dalton's voice was rough with emotion as he made the same promises to her. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them man and wife, Dalton kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. They celebrated with dinner at the boarding house, a simple meal that tasted like the finest feast. Dalton held Hannah's hand across the table, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, and she could not stop smiling. That night, in a room made private with a locked door, they consummated their marriage. It was Hannah's first time, and Dalton was patient and gentle, taking his time to ensure her pleasure matched his own. There was some pain, but it was overwhelmed by the joy of finally being completely joined with him, of learning his body as he learned hers. Afterward they lay tangled together, and Hannah traced the scars on Dalton's chest, the marks of a life lived hard. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Dalton replied, his arms tightening around her. "My wife." The word sent a thrill through Hannah. Wife. She was a wife now, bound to this man who had offered her shelter from a storm and ended up offering her everything. They stayed in Payson for another 3 days, enjoying their brief honeymoon. Dalton bought Hannah a simple gold ring from the general store, and she bought him a new hat to replace the one that had seen better days. They walked through the snowy streets hand in hand, and Hannah felt the stares of the townspeople but did not care. Let them wonder. Let them gossip. She had never been happier. On their last day in town, Hannah wrote a long letter to her sister explaining everything. She tried to convey the depth of her feelings for Dalton, the certainty she felt that this was right. She asked Clara to forgive her for not making it to the ranch, but promised to visit in the spring. She addressed the letter carefully and left it with the postal clerk, along with a prayer that Clara would understand. The journey back to Dalton's cabin took another 2 days. By the time they arrived, the snow had begun to melt in earnest, revealing patches of brown earth and dead grass. The cabin looked exactly as they had left it, solid and welcoming. "Welcome home, Mrs. Anderson," Dalton said, lifting Hannah from her horse. "It sounds strange," Hannah admitted, laughing, "but I like it, Mrs. Anderson." They settled into married life with surprising ease. The rhythm they had established during Hannah's first days in the cabin served them well. They divided chores naturally, each playing to their strengths. Dalton handled the heavy outdoor work, tending the horses and maintaining the property. Hannah took charge of the domestic tasks, cooking and cleaning and mending, but also insisted on helping with the horses and learning the business of ranching. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow retreated up the mountains, and new grass began to emerge in the valleys. Dalton began ranging farther afield, checking on his scattered cattle. Often Hannah rode with him, learning to sit her horse for long hours, developing the skills of a ranch wife. Dalton was a patient teacher, showing her how to read the land, how to spot signs of predators or illness in the herd. In early April, a letter arrived from Clara. Hannah opened it with trembling hands, afraid of what her sister might say. But Clara's response was warmer than she had dared hope. Her sister expressed surprise, of course, and some concern, but ultimately she was happy for Hannah. She invited both Hannah and Dalton to visit once the baby was born, which should be sometime in late May or early June. "We will go," Dalton said when Hannah showed him the letter. "I want to meet your sister, and I should properly introduce myself to your brother-in-law." In May, they made the journey to Clara's ranch. It was a 3-day ride through country that was bursting into bloom, the desert alive with wildflowers. Hannah had never seen the high desert in spring, and the beauty of it took her breath away. Dalton watched her face as she exclaimed over each new wonder, his own expression soft with love. Clara's ranch was modest but well-maintained, situated in a green valley with a creek running through it. Clara herself was hugely pregnant, moving with the careful waddle of a woman near her time. She embraced Hannah fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you were dead when the storm hit," she said, her voice muffled against Hannah's shoulder. "I sent Walter out looking for you as soon as the weather cleared, but he could not find any trace." "I am sorry I frightened you," Hannah said, holding her sister tight. "But I am here now and I am well, better than well." Clara pulled back and studied Dalton, who stood a respectful distance away. "So you are the cowboy who stole my sister's heart in the middle of a blizzard?" "Yes, madam," Dalton said, meeting her eyes steadily. "And I promise you I will take care of her. She will never want for anything as long as I am alive." Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you, and I can see Hannah is happy. That is all I have ever wanted for her," she smiled. "Come inside. Walter is eager to meet you both." They spent a week at the ranch, and it was a good time. Walter proved to be a kind, practical man who got along well with Dalton. The two men spent hours discussing cattle and rangeland management, while Hannah helped Clara prepare for the baby's arrival. She sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart clenching with anticipation of becoming an aunt. Clara's baby, a boy they named Thomas, arrived 10 days after Hannah and Dalton's visit, though they were long gone by then. Word reached them a month later through a traveling preacher, and Hannah wept with joy at the news that both mother and baby were healthy. The summer passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. Dalton's herd grew, and with it, their prosperity. Hannah took in sewing work from the few scattered ranches in the area, more because she enjoyed it than because they needed the money. She also discovered a talent for the business side of ranching, helping Dalton keep accounts and negotiate sales. In the fall, Hannah realized she was pregnant. She told Dalton one evening as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. He stared at her for a long moment, then let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby pasture. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly, his hand splayed across her still flat belly. "Hannah, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" she asked, though the answer was written all over his face. "I have never been happier, not even the day you married me." He kissed her deeply. Though that was a very good day, too. The pregnancy was relatively easy, for which Hannah was grateful. She continued to work alongside Dalton through the fall and into early winter, only slowing down when her growing belly made riding uncomfortable. Dalton became almost comically protective, fretting over her constantly until Hannah had to tell him firmly that she was pregnant, not made of glass. Their son was born in March of 1884 on a night when the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Hannah thought she might not survive it. But Dalton stayed with her throughout, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement. When their son finally emerged, squalling and red-faced, Hannah held him to her chest and wept with relief and exhaustion and overwhelming love. "He is perfect," Dalton said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hannah, he is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Hannah looked down at her son, at his tiny fists and the shock of dark hair so like his father's. "Daniel," she said, "after your father." Dalton's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that, of course. Family is important." Hannah smiled up at him. "Write to your parents. Tell them about Daniel. Tell them about me. It is time to mend those fences, Dalton." Dalton did right, and to his surprise and delight, his family responded with warmth and enthusiasm. His mother sent a long letter full of joy and relief that he was well and happy. She included advice about raising children and a promise to visit when the baby was older. His father's letter was shorter but no less heartfelt, expressing pride in the life Dalton had built and the family he was creating. The years that followed were good ones. Dalton's ranch prospered, and they were able to build a larger house, though they kept the original cabin for sentimental reasons. Hannah gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter they named Hope in 1886, and another son, Marcus, in 1888. The children grew up wild and free in the high country, learning to ride before they could properly walk, helping with the ranch work as soon as they were able. True to his word, Dalton took Hannah traveling. They made trips to California several times, showing the children the ocean and the great city of San Francisco. They visited Clara's growing family regularly, and Daniel, Hope, and Marcus grew up close to their cousins. Dalton's family came to visit as well, his parents and siblings making the long journey from Missouri to meet Hannah and see the life their son and brother had built. As the years passed, Hannah sometimes thought back to that January night when she had stumbled half-frozen to Dalton's door. She thought about how close she had come to dying, and how that brush with death had led to everything she held dear. It was strange how life worked, how a disaster could become a blessing, how a storm could blow you directly to where you were always meant to be. One evening in the summer of 1895, Hannah sat on the porch of their house watching the sunset. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter floating on the warm air. Daniel was 11 now, tall and serious like his father. Hope was 9, with Hannah's blue eyes and Dalton's adventurous spirit. Marcus was 7, sweet-natured and gentle, always bringing Hannah wildflowers and interesting rocks. Dalton emerged from the barn and crossed the yard to join her, settling into the chair beside hers with a contented sigh. His hair was shot through with silver now, lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth, but he was still the man Hannah had fallen in love with in the space of 5 days. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, taking her hand. "That night," Hannah said. "The storm. How I thought I was going to die, and instead I found you." Dalton smiled. "I think about it too. How you fell through my door like an answer to a prayer I did not know I was praying." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. "Best storm of my life. Mine too." Hannah leaned her head on his shoulder. "When you asked me to stay forever, not just that night, I thought you were crazy." "I was crazy, crazy in love. We both were." Hannah watched their children playing at the house they had built together, at the life they had created from a chance meeting in a blizzard. But it was the best kind of crazy. "Do you ever regret it?" Dalton asked quietly. "Giving up your dreams of traveling, of seeing the world?" Hannah considered the question seriously. It was true that she had not traveled as extensively as she had once imagined she might, But she had seen California. She had visited Clara regularly. She had made trips to Denver and Santa Fe. And more importantly, she had built something solid and real with a man she loved beyond measure. She had raised 3 healthy, happy children. She had a home and a purpose and a partner who still made her heart race when he smiled at her. "No," she said firmly, "I do not regret a single thing. This life, our life together, it is better than any dream I could have imagined. You gave me shelter from the storm, Dalton. But more than that, you gave me a home. A real home, not just a place but a feeling. You gave me forever." Dalton pulled her closer, and they sat together as the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Inside the house, the smell of dinner cooking drifted out through the open windows. In the yard, the children played, their joy unbounded. Years continued to pass in the way they do, bringing change and growth. Daniel grew into a fine young man, taking on more and more responsibility for the ranch. He married at 22, a sweet-faced girl named Emma from Payson, and they built a house on the eastern edge of the property. Hope proved to have her mother's independent streak, announcing at 16 that she wanted to attend normal school and become a teacher. Dalton and Hannah supported her dream, and she went to Flagstaff for her education, returning summers to help with the ranch. Marcus discovered a talent for working with horses, developing a reputation as a gifted trainer. In 1901, Dalton and Hannah celebrated their 18th anniversary. They were both in their mid-40s now, their youth behind them but still vital and healthy. The ranch was thriving, their children were launched successfully into their own lives, and they had grandchildren toddling around the property. One evening in early winter, Dalton suggested they ride up to the old cabin. It had been months since they had visited, and he wanted to check on it. Hannah agreed readily, always happy for time alone with her husband. The ride through the snowy landscape brought back memories with crystal clarity. Hannah could almost see her younger self, desperate and freezing, stumbling toward the promise of shelter. Could almost feel the fear she had experienced, the certainty that she was going to die in the storm. The cabin was just as they had left it, small and sturdy. They built a fire in the old fireplace and stood close together, warming their hands. "You remember that first night?" Dalton asked, pulling Hannah into his arms. "When you fell through the door half dead from cold?" "I remember everything," Hannah said, resting her head against his chest. "I remember thinking you were so handsome even though I was nearly frozen. I remember the coffee you gave me, how it was the best thing I had ever tasted. I remember lying in your bed that first night and listening to you breathe and feeling safe for the first time in years." "I knew the moment I saw you," Dalton said softly. "I looked into your face and something just clicked into place, like I had been waiting my whole life and did not even know it, and suddenly there you were. That is why you asked me to stay, after only 5 days. That is why I asked you to stay. I could not let you walk out of my life. I would have spent the rest of my life wondering and regretting." Dalton tipped her face up to his. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Hannah Anderson, the absolute best thing." "You are the best thing that ever happened to me too," Hannah said. She kissed him, slow and deep, and for a moment they were young again, new lovers discovering each other in the firelight. They made love in the old cabin, on the bed where Hannah had recovered from her brush with death, where they had first kissed, where they had talked through the night building the foundation of their life together. It felt like coming full circle, like acknowledging the roots of the great tree their love had grown into. Later, as they lay tangled together under blankets, Hannah said, "Tell me again. Tell me what you said that morning when the storm broke." Dalton smiled in the darkness. He knew exactly what she wanted to hear. "Stay," he said softly. Not just until the snow melts, stay forever. And I said yes, Hannah whispered. I said yes, and it was the best decision I ever made. We both said yes, Dalton corrected gently, to each other, to this life, to forever. They rode back down to the main house the next morning, their hands clasped together, their hearts full. The years stretched ahead of them, unknown but promising. There would be more grandchildren, more challenges, more joys and sorrows as there always were in life. But they would face it all together, as they had faced everything since that stormy night when fate had brought a freezing woman to a lonely cowboy's door. Hannah often thought, in the years that followed, about the different paths her life might have taken, if the storm had not struck when it did. If she had sought shelter somewhere else. If Dalton had been a different kind of man, less kind or less bold. But those alternative histories felt insubstantial, like dreams half remembered upon waking. This life, the one she had built with Dalton, was the only one that felt real. In 1910, they celebrated their 27th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren. Daniel and Emma had given them 4 grandchildren. Hope, who had married a fellow teacher, had 2. Marcus and his wife had 3, with another on the way. The house rang with laughter and chaos and love. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Hannah and Dalton sat together on the porch as they had done countless times before. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, brilliant and cold and beautiful. 27 years, Hannah said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes it feels like forever. It is forever, Dalton said, his voice rough with age but still strong. Forever started the night you knocked on my door. Everything before that was just waiting. Hannah turned to look at him, at the man who had been her husband, her partner, her best friend for more than half her life. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were the same amber color that had captured her heart all those years ago. And when he looked at her, she could still see the young cowboy who had asked her to stay forever. I would do it all again, she said. Every moment, even the hard parts, even the times that hurt, I would choose you again every single time. As I would choose you, Dalton replied. He stood and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet. Come to bed, my love. Tomorrow is another day and I want to spend it with you, just as I want to spend every day I have left with you. They walked into the house together, hand in hand, closing the door on the night. Inside was warmth and light, and the life they had built from a chance meeting in a storm. Outside, the stars continued their dance, indifferent and eternal, witnesses to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. The years that followed were kind to them. They grew old together, watching their grandchildren grow and begin having children of their own. The ranch continued to prosper under Daniel's management, and the family remained close. Hope became a respected educator, eventually running a school in Flagstaff. Marcus's horses were sought after throughout the territory, and later the state when Arizona achieved statehood in 1912. In the winter of 1920, Dalton fell ill. It was pneumonia, the doctor said, and at his age recovery would be difficult. Hannah nursed him tirelessly, refusing to leave his side. Their children came and the house filled with family, all of them wanting to be near. One evening, as Hannah sat beside Dalton's bed holding his hand, he opened his eyes and looked at her with perfect clarity. Hannah, he said, his voice barely a whisper. My Hannah. I am here, she said, leaning close. I am right here, my love. Best storm of my life, Dalton said, and there was a ghost of his old smile on his lips. You saved me, you know. I was so lonely before you came, so lost. You gave me everything. You gave me everything, Hannah said, tears streaming down her face. You gave me a home and a family and a love I never dreamed was possible. You asked me to stay forever, and I have. I will always stay with you, Dalton. Always. Forever, Dalton whispered. Not just tonight. Forever, Hannah agreed. Not just tonight. Forever and ever. Dalton's eyes closed and his breathing eased. He died peacefully 2 hours later, surrounded by family with Hannah's hand in his. The grief was crushing, a physical weight on Hannah's chest that made breathing difficult. But even in her sorrow, she was grateful. Grateful for the 37 years they had shared. Grateful for the family they had created. Grateful that fate had sent a blizzard to drive her to his door all those years ago. Hannah lived another 10 years after Dalton's death, cared for lovingly by her children and grandchildren. She spent her days working in her garden, sewing clothes for the great-grandchildren, and telling stories about the old days. Her favorite story, the one she never tired of telling, was about the night she sought shelter from a storm and found instead the love of her life. "He asked me to stay forever," she would say, her blue eyes distant with memory. "Not just that night, but forever. And I said yes, and oh, what a beautiful forever it turned out to be." When Hannah passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1930, she was buried beside Dalton on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their children erected a simple headstone that read, "She sought shelter from the snow. He said stay forever, not just tonight." And so she did. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family, a testament to what two people could build when they had the courage to say yes to love. And sometimes, on winter nights when the snow fell thick and fast, people swore they could see two figures standing on the porch of the old cabin on the mountain, hand in hand, watching the storm together. The story of Hannah and Dalton became legend in the area, told and retold around fires and dinner tables. It became a story about fate and courage and the transformative power of love. It became a reminder that sometimes the worst storms bring the greatest blessings, that disaster can become miracle, that a single moment of courage can change everything. Their great-great-grandchildren still live on the land, still run cattle in the valleys, still visit the old cabin where it all began. The cabin has been preserved carefully, maintained as a reminder of the family's origins. Inside, on a shelf above the fireplace, sits a small collection of mementos, a worn copy of The Tempest, a simple gold ring, a faded letter from Clara congratulating Hannah on her marriage. And on cold winter nights, when the snow falls and the wind howls around the cabin walls, it is easy to imagine a young woman stumbling through the storm, desperate and freezing. Easy to imagine a lonely cowboy opening his door to find salvation standing on his threshold. Easy to imagine the moment when their eyes met and both of their lives changed forever, because that is what love does. It changes everything. It transforms ordinary moments into miracles. It takes two lonely people and makes them whole. It turns a cabin into a home and strangers into soulmates. Hannah sought shelter from the snow that night in January 1883. What she found instead was everything she had ever wanted and so much more than she had ever dreamed. She found home. She found purpose. She found a love that lasted not just a lifetime but generations, rippling forward through time. And it all started because a cowboy with amber eyes and a kind heart looked at a half-frozen stranger on his doorstep and made the bravest offer of his life. Stay forever, not just tonight. She stayed. And in staying, she found forever.